What's up, everyone? Pastor Matt here. Thanks for checking into my YouTube channel. We're going to talk about Jordan Peterson today and his influence. Should Christians listen to Dr. Peterson and be influenced by what he has to say? Well, let's get into that. Again, my name is Matt. I'm the pastor of Gospel Fellowship PCA, a Reformed church just north of Pittsburgh. If you're looking for a good Bible-believing church from the Reformed tradition, please come check us out. gospelfellowshippca.org. Okay, so Jordan Peterson. Well, why bring him up right now? Well, the reason we bring up Jordan Peterson right at the moment is that he just recently issued a very important health update with his daughter, Michaela Peterson, on her podcast, which I listen to from time to time, find it somewhat interesting. And it appears that Jordan Peterson's health has been greatly improved, although he's had a terrible year. His wife nearly dying of cancer, and he himself going through some very serious issues related to chemical dependence and mental health. You might want to check out that long podcast that explains the entire thing in more detail that I'm interested in getting into today. But the question I'd like to discuss is, now that Dr. Peterson appears to be coming back into the public fray, what should Christians think about him and his influence, and in particular Reformed Christians? Now, what I'm going to say today, although I'm a Reformed Christian myself, I'm Presbyterian, I think is going to have broad application to almost all Christians, so don't let the title of this video dissuade you. Nevertheless, I am a Reformed Christian, so my perspective is, of course, going to reflect my own convictions in some ways. So the first time I heard about Dr. Peterson was actually several years ago. One of my colleagues, another Presbyterian pastor, asked me what my thoughts were and whether I'd read his books. And my first off-the-cuff response was, "Who in the world is Jordan Peterson? I've never heard of him." And he looked at me somewhat aghast and said, "Well, I guarantee the young men in your church have heard of him. He is the most important philosopher and perhaps academic in the world today." And that took me off guard because I read a lot of books. But most of the stuff that I read is Christian, to be honest. Reformed theological stuff, historical theology. So I'd never heard of Jordan Peterson, and so after that conversation, somebody told me he was one of the most important philosophers in the world. I figured I'd better go home and give him a quick Google. And when I did, I became very much interested in what he has to say, because he is an extremely compelling and a teacher with some authority, we might have to admit. So what I want to do today is kind of simple. I want to look at his rise. I'm going to look at some things that are positive that Dr. Peterson says and teaches, and then I'm going to look at a few critiques that I think should make Christians wary of his influence. So let's get into his rise. There is right now a new documentary on Amazon Prime, which I just watched with my family, about his rise and influence. Very well done. 5 out of 5 stars as far as I'm concerned. More just for the human interest story of his rise and his influence. Jordan Peterson, if you're not aware, is a psychology professor, a clinical psychologist at the University of Toronto, where he first came into acclaim because of a law in Canada called C-16, which was going to prohibit certain usages of speech in which it would be compelled, not just required or recommended, but compelled to use people's preferred gender pronouns. And as a university professor, Jordan Peterson said, "No, I'm not going to allow my speech to be compelled in that way." And so he got drawn into a controversy related to gender, sexuality. Although he claims to not be anti-LGBTQ, he refused to use preferred pronouns if they differ from a biological birth, for the reason of its being a compelled speech, which he said freedom of speech should not permit and tolerate. So he kind of came into acclaim that way. Then, obviously very controversial acclaim, not universal commendation, I should say. Then the next thing that happened is Jordan Peterson did a hugely important interview with what's called Channel 4 in England. This interview is probably the best introduction to Jordan Peterson's thoughts, personality, his compelling logic, his apparently very strong knowledge in his fields. In this interview, he's talking primarily with Kathy Newman, the interviewer, about women's wages and women's rights. And despite her every attempt to strawman his arguments and to misrepresent what he is saying, Jordan Peterson does he comes across as extraordinarily compelling in this interview. You definitely need to watch this if you haven't seen it so far. His intellect, his knowledge, his very clear and rigorous logic is obviously apparent, and he refuses to be painted into the corners as Cathy Newman attempts to do this to him again and again and again. Not only about women's issues, but gender and sexuality related issues as well. So if you haven't watched anything from Jordan Peterson, probably the Channel 4 interview, easily Googleable on YouTube, would be a good first introduction to the kind of stalwart mind that Jordan Peterson possesses. Now, then, what should a Reformed Christian think about his overall message? Well, let me give you a few strengths and weaknesses that may help you to decide whether or not you want to listen to some of his stuff or read some of his books, especially his bestseller 12 Rules for Life, which I'll talk about just in a few moments from now. First of all, let's look at his strengths. We live in a world today where, in my opinion, we desperately need men and women of conviction. Just simple conviction. So much of our culture, our society today, is being ruled by the rage mob. What is outrageous? What does the mob say? What does the Twitterverse say? We are compelled, we are pushed into fear by what we might call cancel culture, which is the idea that if you say something wrong, people will rage against you in a massive online push. We might even call it a digital riot in order to get people removed from their positions of influence. And so that is so proliferous in today's society that it almost seems to me that we need to have men and women that are people of conviction, that stand upon what they believe, and they are able to rebut adequately with logic, facts, and information the kind of emotional furor that the rage mob is able to create. Jordan Peterson, to his credit, is one such person who has unassailable conviction on what he believes. And so for me, that's a check mark in the right category. Clearly, this is a man with absolute mastery of his material and has a relentless approach towards logic. Going back to that Cathy Newman interview on Channel 4, which I'll post a link to that in the description of this video, it's very apparent how he does not fall for what we might call the informal logical fallacies that are so abundant in today's thought. In society, in news, in media, we are just absolutely filled with the informal logical fallacies like straw manning. There's so many informal fallacies, and I've written on this before, but Jordan Peterson does not fall for any of them. In fact, one of the most poignant moments in the interview is where she's trying to misrepresent what he has just said, and he very sternly says, "I'm very careful with my words." And in fact, he is. It's almost hard to ever find him saying something in a way that is sloppy or inaccurate. He is just a very clear thinker, and so I find that to be something that is quite compelling from my perspective. His command of his material is excellent. A couple of years ago, he did a series of speeches in which he basically traveled the world and did a number of talks on psychology, culture, Marxism, socialism, capitalism, gender rights, all these kinds of things. And he would speak for 90 minutes to an hour and a half without even using his notes. Now, as a speaker myself, I find that gripping. And one of the things he did is every single talk he gave was different from the last. So it wasn't as though he had one canned talk that he gave in a bunch of different venues, but he would literally invent his talks from his mind, from his vast knowledge of his material, off the cuff, and deliver them in compelling, logically forthright ways that, as a speaker myself, I find overwhelming. It's very difficult to do that. Much easier to listen to a lecture than to give one. And to give one with coherence and power is an extraordinary virtue, so he has that. In terms of his background, he is a clinical psychologist. And that means he has some very interesting things to say when it comes to the difference between men and women. And this would be, again, one of his strengths, in my view, is that he is able to differentiate the biological differences between men and women. Now, of course, you probably know that leftist, socialistic, Marxist influenced ideology does not really acknowledge that there are any biological differences between men and women. But Jordan Peterson has mastered the actual research, the clinical research in that field that demonstrates that there is differences between men and women biologically. And those differences, as you'll hear him say in a number of his talks, mostly have to do with the two traits of agreeableness versus extroversion or aggressiveness. It's not that certain women can't be aggressive and that certain men can't be agreeable, but by and large, in terms of large group categories and numerical differentiation, there is some meaningful statistical differences between men and women in that way. In terms of his knowledge of history, again, I find him to be a very compelling figure. Jordan Peterson did a ton of his research in the areas that I've already mentioned: socialism, Marxism, and communism. And so when Jordan Peterson speaks, for instance, about the history and influence of Germany in the early 20th century, mid-20th century, or Russia under Stalin or Lenin, or the Chinese government under Mao, he speaks as one with authority. He clearly has a grip on this historical material and is able to deliver some lessons on these things in a way that is cognitively persuasive. Let's put it that way. When it comes to Jordan Peterson's response to critical theory, once again, I find him to be a very helpful voice. Critical theory, if you're not aware, is the idea that most social structures are formed on the basis of power and oppressive hierarchies. And so we see that a lot today in our discussions on race and class, especially as it seems as though the United States of America is headed towards a new era of Marxist-driven socialism. Jordan Peterson is a breath of fresh air in this regard because he does not believe that social and institutional hierarchies are primarily formed by oppressive hierarchies, but rather that they are primarily formed by competency hierarchies. So to give an example, if a person rises to the head of a Fortune 500 company, Peterson would argue that rather than that being an example of oppression, either racial or gender-based or whatever, class-based, that probably says more about personality and professional competencies than it does anything else. And so he's able to, with statistical data, back those claims in a way that I feel is persuasive, that many of our institutional hierarchies are competency-based and not based on oppression. So that's helpful. He has some very helpful motivational talks too. Now, listen, I'm a Bible expositor, so motivational speaking is not my thing. In fact, for the most part, I don't buy into motivational speaking. However, Jordan Peterson has this bit about clean your room and taking charge of in your life the things that you're able to take charge of. And his stuff there I do find to be very informative. Probably one of the things that is very helpful in terms of practical application is Peterson's discussion on personality traits. Peterson believes that human personality can be roughly grouped around 5 main headings, and let me give them to you now. Agreeableness, which is your ability to be kind and compassionate to others, understanding, give and take in terms of relationships. Neuroticism, which would be stresses, fears, anxieties. We all have those to varying and different degrees. Conscientiousness, which is your dutifulness to the responsibilities that you hold as an individual and as a community member. Creativity, which is expresses itself through arts, writing, public speaking, those sorts of things. And then finally, extroversion and aggressiveness. Now, all of us have these traits in various measures, but what Peterson does that is, again, helpful is to help you find what those things may be or where they may lack in your personality and how to use those to your personal and professional advantage. All of these things, I would say, are strengths and to the credit line in Jordan Peterson's overall body of work, especially his YouTube videos, his talks, and his writings. Now let's get into some of his weaknesses, because as a Christian, we can't fully endorse the teachings of Dr. Peterson for the following reasons. First of all, number one, his views on Bible, Scripture, creation, and redemption are seriously flawed. Seriously flawed. Now, this is going to fly in the face of practically everything I've just said about his helpfulness, but his teachings on the Bible I find to be reckless, non-persuasive, somewhat incoherent, and generally a bad source from which to study the Scriptures. Now, why is he talking about the Bible? Well, Jordan Peterson has an entire series of lectures on Scripture, but for the most part, his view on Scripture is a deconstructionist view. He takes apart the Scriptures and primarily sees them from a psychological perspective, not at all a revelatory perspective. And so from that point, he is beginning at the wrong point as far as interpreting Scripture. I don't believe that he has any view that Scripture is inspired, certainly not inerrant or infallible, but he sees it mostly as a collection of meta-narrative stories that have been passed on from generation to generation that do have some kind of psychological or internal value to people of faith. But again, of all of the stuff that he has out there, his biblical lectures are by far the worst and the weakest. Secondly, Jordan Peterson constantly speaks from an evolutionary perspective. Some of the openings to his material is deeply evolutionary, and Jordan Peterson sees a direct line of evolution from things like lobsters and chimpanzees directly to full expressions of humanity as we are, human beings. He does not believe in six-day creation. I'm not sure that he believes in creation at all. And he certainly doesn't see human beings as being distinct in any way from the animal kingdoms. And so he would have no theology, for instance, of the imago Dei, or the image of God in man. And so inasmuch as evolutionary theory finds its way into many of his talks, I find that to be unhelpful. Next, his book, 12 Rules for Life, which I'm going to be the first one to admit I have not read the book. However, I have listened to many of the lectures attending the book, 12 Rules for Life. And my fear is that in this kind of an approach to self-improvement is that we find ourselves once again in some sort of self-improvement campaign for redeeming oneself rather than turning to Christ in the gospel. Even the title 12 Rules for Life seems to imply that here are 12 more laws that you need to obey in order to be a good person. We already have the Ten Commandments. We already have numerous laws in the Scripture that we are completely unable to fulfill. That's why we need divine grace. And this is the biggest hole in all of Jordan Peterson's teaching, is that while he has room for human forgiveness and things of this, thinks it's very important, he does not fundamentally understand what grace from God, from a holy God, especially through the person of Jesus Christ, looks like, or what it would mean to experience that sort of grace. So you're not going to find in Jordan Peterson any kind of grace that's going to actually remit your guilt or take away your sin and your shame, though he will give you some very practical things on how you might improve yourself personally and professionally. Finally, he is not orthodox in any sense of the word, although I don't personally know what his spiritual state is. I get the sense that he is not a believer. He has said some things from time to time that verge on theism, although that's probably as far as we can go unless he's experienced some new experience of saving grace more recently. And perhaps God is working in his life through his illness this past year, and it'll be interesting to see what Jordan Peterson has to say, especially in this crazy year 2020. So I realize I've gone almost 20 minutes now talking about Jordan Peterson. Let me end with a couple of recommendations. First of all, his Amazon docu history called The Rise of Jordan Peterson. I very much appreciated it. I thought it was very helpful. I watched it with my family, although there's some rough patches in this, and there's probably some language, although I don't really recall. That would be a helpful introduction to his work. Secondly, I can recommend his Channel 4 interview, which was very helpful. And third, some of his stuff on personality profiles could be very applicable to some people. with the great caveat that this man is not a Christian. He hardly speaks from a theistic perspective, certainly from an evolutionary perspective, which we reject as creationists. Though many of the things that he has to say about socialism, Marxism, gender is going to be more and more relevant in the days to come. Well, let me know where I got it wrong in this video. I'm sure there's some of you out there that are jumping at the opportunity to say something in the comments. Please feel free to do so. By the way, don't forget, here's my book, Hold Fast to Faith, the devotional commentary on the Westminster Confession of Faith. If you want to buy it on Amazon, it's out there for you to acquire. But if you want a free PDF of it, I will be glad to just send it to you for no cost whatsoever. Just email me, Google me, search me up, email me, and I will give you Hold Fast to Faith free on PDF for your own personal edification. All right, thank you so much for checking into this video. I do love you lots, and I will talk to you later.